God, everybody. This has been a very light series, so man, I'm so tired, I'll tell you. Let's start the way, I'm going to repeat what I did last week, because if we lose sight of this whole series then accomplishes something that I don't think is pure or holy or good. And we have to start with those two questions again. What does Jesus tell us is the number one commandment? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And what's the second? Love your neighbor as yourself. So if I say anything in this and you forget that foundation, you'll go the wrong direction. The second thing I ask you is, with whom did Jesus struggle most? With the righteous people, not the sinners. Now, with the sinners, he said, go and sin no more. And he said that because his law is not given arbitrarily. He wants you to know that his precepts are based on his love for you. He's the creator, designer. So if you live within the parameters of his design, you're going to have your best life possible. You violate those designs, things are going to fall apart. So he struggled with the self-righteous people, the people that thought, we don't have sin, we don't have any problems, we don't really need you. And he said, you need to wake up. You need to become spiritually woke and realize you got sin in your life too. And you need to repent. And stop looking at your brother or your sister's sin as somehow worse than yours. Everybody needs Jesus, right? He's the hope of the world. Now, the whole series has been based on this idea on Ephesians 6, where we're told that the struggle that you and I are facing right now is not against flesh and blood. So our struggle is not with people. It's with what? Rulers, powers, world forces. And we broke that down. I can't do it again because of time, but we showed you how the Apostle Paul gives us a sort of strata. It tells us that there's a hierarchy in the demonic world, and they are very strategically organized. And their whole purpose is to bring humanity down, to destroy what God loves most. We also talked about when the Judeo-Christian movement, when the Jesus movement hit planet Earth, when Jesus came, that something beautiful happened, that as it spread throughout the Western world, that the Western world began to flourish. Because as you live by the precepts of Jesus, humanity just gets along better. Think about it. Pray for those who persecute you. That's pretty awesome. Difficult, but awesome. Forgive those who've offended you. And so what we found is the structure of culture, society, and the family became stronger because of the Jesus movement. Families stayed together in the covenant of marriage. Sex was between a man and a woman in the context of marriage. God, the Bible, Jesus were respected, considered to be sacred. So when that happened, these ancient demonic forces were pushed and relegated to the fringes of society. They were still there. They were kind of underground in dark places, shameful places. However, we said that in the 60s, in America, secularism and paganism reached its critical mass. And as a result, the demonic forces that were relegated to the fringes by the Jesus movement have now returned. So we've talked about two gods that have returned. And I wonder sometimes, Satan always tries to counterfeit what God has done. So there's a trinity, God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. I wonder if there's a dark trinity, three gods that try to undo what the biblical trinity have tried to accomplish. Well, we know in ancient literature that we find three gods that dominate the ancient world and that take on different forms as culture develops. So we've talked about the god Baal, who shows up, and basically what he does is try to turn our attention away from God, the pursuit of God, to pursuit of something God has created, materialism. So instead of worshiping God, we worship the blessings God has given us. So we turn our attention to money and wealth and power, and those are the things that give us meaning and security. So when Baal leaves, he ushers in Ishtar. We spend a lot of time talking about Ishtar. Ishtar is the god of sex, illicit, of pornography, of every form of sexual immorality that you can imagine. And we traced how in those ancient writings, those things have been around for a long time. And the purpose is that historically speaking, man gets weary of pleasure. It's an interesting thing. He has so much pleasure, he gets weary, so he's got to try something else. So he moves from worshiping stuff, materialism, to finding a way to worship one another. There's a great quote, and I think it's connected well with Ishtar or with the Ashtoreth in the Old Testament. And it goes like this: meaningless does not come from being weary of pain. Meaning comes from being weary of pleasure. Pleasure without God, without the sacred boundaries, will actually leave you emptier than before. In other words, when God goes, another God takes his place, and that God will create insatiable lusts without a way to fill them. okay? Can't go back to that. We have the third and final God this weekend, and then the whole series culminates next week. And remember, I told you, this series cannot be segmentable. You cannot compartmentalize this series. If you take one without the other, it can produce hate. I don't want you to do that. If you take another without the other, it can produce apathy. You got to take them all together with the culmination next weekend as we talk about how are we then to go out and live in a world where the gods have returned. So the third God is a God by the name of Molech. He's the ancient god associated with Ishtar and Baal. You'll find him throughout ancient civilizations. His title is the destroyer. In 1 Kings 11:7, then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, on the hill that is east of Jerusalem, and for Molech, the abomination of the people of Ammon. In Leviticus 18, God, as he gives his law, says to his people, and you shall not let any of your descendants pass through the fire of Molech. So when King Josiah attempted to bring the people back to God, he knew that the first thing he would have to do is obliterate the altars of Molech. He knew that Yahweh and Molech cannot coexist. So we're told in 2 Kings chapter 23, and he defiled Topheth, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom, that no man might make his son or daughter pass through the fire of Molech. So this third god, what is the fire? Well, Molech is the spirit and god of child sacrifice. In the epic poem by John Milton, Paradise Lost, Milton writes this: first, Molech, which is another name for Molech, horrid king besmeared with blood of human sacrifice and parents' tears, though for the noise of drums and timbrels loud, their children's cries unheard that pass through fire to his grim idol. Winston Churchill used the figure of Molech to speak of the evil of Adolf Hitler. He said he, meaning Hitler, had conjured up the fearful idol of an all-devouring Moloch, of which he was priest and incarnation. What is Churchill saying? He's saying that Hitler was possessed by the spirit of Molech. So what was the worship of Molech like? And we don't have to guess. We find this among the Canaanites, the Greeks, the Romans, the Phoenicians, and their African colony Carthage. And here's what Diodorus Siculus, the Greek historian, writes. There was in their city a bronze image of Cronus, extending its hands, palms up, and sloping toward the ground, so that each of the children, when placed thereon, rolled down and fell into a sort of gaping pit filled with fire. Now, why on earth would you want to murder or sacrifice your own children into the fires of Molech? And here's the answer. And it was happening in almost every culture, not just among the Amalekites, up until the Jesus movement. And the first reason was because the children were undesirable. If they were imperfect or blemished in some way, in fact, we've said before, until Jesus came along, girls were not safe in the ancient world. They were the first to be sacrificed because they were seen to be more of a liability rather than an asset in an agrarian society. The other reason that you would sacrifice your children in the fires of Molech is for the blessing of economic prosperity. A woman would be told that she would obtain the God's favor and her fields would be fruitful if she sacrificed her child in the fires of Molech for future economic success. Now, you and I can't imagine people offering their newborn babies up in a fire, and that's because you've been impacted by the Judeo-Christian value. That's why. The Greek historian Cleitarchus wrote for Alexander the Great, and here's what he said. Out of reverence for Cronus, the Phoenicians, and especially the Carthaginians, whenever they seek to obtain some great favor, vow one of their children, burning it as a sacrifice to the deity if they are especially eager to gain success. Now listen, just as Baal ushers in Ishtar, remember what Baal does? He turns our attention away from God into the things God's created. Ishtar ushers in Molech. You say, in what way? Listen carefully. Ishtar ushers in unrestrained sex with no apparent concern with the ramifications. So in ancient times, in modern times as well, but in ancient times, children were often the result of temple worship and sexual promiscuity. So in order to prevent a child born into this situation from hampering the mother or the father's economic life, the child then would be turned around and sacrificed back to Molech. So sexual immorality with Ishtar's temple, An unwanted child occurs with the prostitutes, and then you sacrifice the child to Molech for economic gain. In modern times, as the sexual revolution bore its fruit in the 60s and 70s, and it did bear its fruit, didn't it? More and more children were conceived out of marriage and were more likely to be unwanted and eradicated. Abortion rates skyrocketed in America in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Now, it makes sense. Why? Because those were the years following the sexual revolution. So children, unwanted, unplanned children, were produced from the sexual revolution, right? Free sex. That actually wasn't free. It cost us immensely. And I'm going to make a statement. It's going to be very harsh. And like I said, you have to take all the sermons together. But abortion has become the modern day sacrifice to Molech. Remember once again that the influence of the Jesus movement, with the entrance of the gospel into the West, there was this inevitable clash or collision over the values of the sanctity of human life. So because of the Jesus movement, the value of women, the treatment of the weak, the care of the sick, and the worth and protection of children born and unborn, the gospel brought an end to inequality and infanticide in the Roman world. And as the Jesus movement spread like wildfire through the West, I had no idea until I'd done this research, because I'd heard this verse, but I had no idea until I'd done this research, the power of Psalm 139, the role that it played in the Jesus movement when it came to being concerned for the kids. Psalm 139, you formed my inward parts. You covered me in my mother's womb. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in secret. And in your book they were all written, the days fashioned for me, when as yet there were none of them. Suddenly, the Jesus movement understood that even when in our mother's womb, we are alive and we are a gift of God and we are being shaped and formed, and God knows the number of our days. It was the Christian faith and the biblical valuing of life that brought protection to the young and unborn children and the definitive end of large-scale murder. Now listen. As a result, it really shouldn't be any surprise that after renouncing Christianity, that the Soviet Union became the first state to legalize the killing of the unborn. And then in the case of other, I guess you would call it demonically anti-Christian power, or the primary demonically un-Christian power in our time, the 20th century, Nazi Germany, the killing of the unborn had more to do with the genocide of impure humans, right? The Ubermensch, the superhuman, the master race. And then, of course, if you know the story, you'll know that to promote economic success throughout Germany, the Jews were blamed for having stolen the economy, so they began to eradicate them one by one. In fact, historically speaking, folks, Molech is especially interested in Jewish children. He killed thousands in the ancient times, and in Germany and Europe, his spirit inspired the killing of millions, 500,000 being the unborn. So here's the question, we've asked it every week. Has Molech returned to America? Man, that's not a hard question to answer, is it? Whenever Christ is denounced and the God of the Bible eradicated, the killings began, and now here we are in America. In the late 1960s, a handful of American states, I got to stop here just for a second. I have to stop. Listen. And I was going to say this to the end, but I don't want to lose you. I know there are some women in here who've had abortions. I hope you know that this is not a message of shame. This is a message to remind you of the forgiving power of Jesus Christ. Okay? The purpose of this message is to not somehow tell you that you're bad and you're worse than anybody else. You're not. You're not. But the purpose is to make us aware of what's going on in culture and to love you and to help you realize Jesus came to set the captives free, and I don't want you to be captive anymore, okay? Now, in the late 1960s, there were a handful of American states that opened the door to Molech by legalizing the killing of unborn children. On January 22nd, 1973, to be exact, the Supreme Court legalized abortion. The stats today are mind-boggling, really. Now, I want to give you, I don't know how much you read about this, and by the way, remember, don't put me in a political forum. This is a biblical sermon, not a political one. So if you're doing that to me, stop it. Okay? 64 million babies we've eradicated. 64 million. When you think about, I think it's 48 million that have died in wars? We've already passed that. 64 million. 86% of all abortions have been performed on unmarried young women. And here's the stat that most of you are not familiar with. 0.5% are victims of rape. Less than 1%, half of 1 percentage point. Because everybody will always say, well, what about rape? We're talking about 99.5% of abortions here. 92% of women who have an abortion give these reasons, and you can research all this for yourself. Inconvenience. It interferes with my educational plans. It interferes with my career. I'm not ready for a child. I can't afford a child. I'm not mature enough for a child. Maybe you weren't mature enough to have sex. There's a way to prevent abortion. The most frequently given answer that leads a mother to kill her unborn child today is that if the child lived, it would hamper the mother's life, her time, energy, educational, or career prospects, her future earning capacities. The child will be a burden to her aspirations. Without the child, she would be in a better position to achieve her goals and attain success and prosperity. And I find it uncanny that in the ancient world, mothers sacrificed their children to Molech because they believed that in doing so, they were invoking prosperity and gain. And here we are in America doing the same thing. During the sacrifice of children to Molech, there would be this loud, strange music played so that the villagers could not hear the screams of the children or the mothers. The Greek philosopher Plutarch writes this, and the whole area before the statue was filled with a loud noise of flutes and drums so that the cries of the wailing should not reach the ears of the people. Today, the horror of putting a baby to death, at least before YouTube, all the disturbing sights and sounds and details are hidden from public view. Somebody forced me to watch a documentary, and I hate watching these because I know where they're going to go, but I watched anyway. And there's a doctor showing his interns how to perform an abortion on a late-stage child. And he goes in with the clamps and whatever he's going to do, and the baby jumps. And he looks at the interns and says, "That's okay, they always do that." Who's they, by the way? And now abortion is seen as something sacred in our culture. Did you know that? Talk about a demonic inversion. Let me read you some quotes. Our culture needs new rituals as well as laws to restore abortion to its sacred dimension. Abortion is a major blessing and a sacrament in the hands of women. It is not immoral to choose abortion. It's simply another kind of morality, a pagan one. Abortion is a sacred act. I actually agree with that. Sacred means connected to the god or gods for religious purposes. Abortion is an offering to the dark gods and goddesses empowered by the dark forces of Ephesians 6. The paganization of America has unleashed the gods of the dark trinity. Jonathan Kahn, I referred to him a lot. I go back to referring you again to his book. He says, the spirit of Baal has caused America to believe that departing from God would bring it freedom. The spirit of Ishtar, had convinced it that if it abandoned its moral safeguards for instant gratification and sexual abandon, it would find fulfillment. And the spirit of Molech had promised to grant it the blessings of an unhindered life if it would only allow him to take away the children. But what was the result in ancient civilization of child sacrifice? Well, let me tell you, brokenness, emptiness, depression, death, in some cases mental illness has been linked to child sacrifice, and of course you can understand why. The destruction of the family, ultimately the destruction of society, and now America is reaping the consequences of its own bloodshed. 64 million murdered children far exceeds anything that Molech accomplished in the ancient world. And without repentance, America will fall. In fact, I would suggest that it's falling now. Now, let me ask you something. Do you love this country? Do you love this country? I love this country. I love my country, and I'm grateful for it. Pray for it, and pray hard. That God would open the eyes of our leaders Don't go out and shoot vitriolic language toward people who disagree with you. Don't go out and exhibit hate. Pray, man, pray, man, pray. And then second, we Christians need to start being more consistent and living the way that we say is right, because 7 out of 10 women who've had abortions identify as Christ followers. Remember what I said last week? If I'm walking this way and I say, follow me, and you go the other way, you're not following me. If Jesus says sex is between a man and a woman in the context of marriage, follow me, and you go the other way, you're not following Jesus. So if you're living together right now and you're not married, just be honest, you're not following Jesus. Baal, Ishtar, and Molech. They are the gods who have returned to destroy the West. But Ishtar is the god or goddess that ushers in the end. Now, I want you to stay with me here. Here's why Ishtar is so damaging. God ordained marriage in the family. He ordered the family to teach and to guide the children of the next generation, the existence of God, the purpose of creation. Ishtar, more than any other god or goddess, desires to destroy the family, to destroy society, and to wound the heart of God. And the demonic forces exist, Jesus told us, to steal, kill, and destroy. So Ishtar not only destroys the sanctity of sex, marriage, and the family, we learned last week that Ishtar desires to change a man's desire for a woman to a man, and a woman's desire for men toward a woman. Now, here's the question. Now, so far, I've only told you what I know in the ancient world. I want to tell you this is now a speculation. This is my speculation, okay? I guess the number one way to destroy society would be to destroy procreation. Right? Well, unless sex is between a man and a woman, it's going to be hard to procreate. And I think one of the temptations, one of the avenues through which Ishtar works to ultimately destroy humanity is to celebrate the methods that break down what is sacred. Remember what we said, what gets celebrated gets repeated. And now think about this. Here we go now. Think about this. In the ancient Middle East, Ishtar was especially known as the goddess of parades and processions. The ancient hymn, The Holy One, begins, "The people of Sumer parade before you. They play the sweet Allah drums before you." So you know that Ishtar has returned to culture to destroy the sanctity of marriage and the family when her parades return and are applauded. Because her parades became a central part in Mesopotamia and the Middle Eastern popular culture. You with me? This is where it gets hard. Come on now, let's go. 5 months after Stonewall, and if you missed last week, sorry. Repent. I can't go over it again. I don't mean that. If you're here for the first time, you're a visitor, welcome. And I'm sorry you're in the middle of this, but there comes a time when a pastor has to do a series like this to make sure we're all on the same page and go on, okay? So if you missed last week, go back, watch it tonight, it'll all make sense. But 5 months after Stonewall, remember what we said about Stonewall? In New York City, the gateway into America, the Stonewall riots, look it up, had become a haven for all that is Ishtar. Male prostitutes, female prostitutes, sex workers, street hustlers, homosexuality, lesbianism. It became a place of celebration of what had previously been uncelebrated. 5 months after the Stonewall riots, gay and lesbian activists met in Philadelphia and planned a march to commemorate the Stonewall uprising. Let me give you a few facts about it, about the march. It would be repeated every year the last Sunday in June. 3 other marches were planned in San Francisco, Chicago, and Los Angeles. There were to be protest marches as well as parades at the same time. And the plan was that with each passing year, more and more parades and more cities would occur and would evolve into what we know today as the gay pride parades and finally pride parades. The similarities, and this is where I had to cut because of time, but the similarities between the pride parades and the ancient parade of Ishtar are uncanny. Just to name a few, the parades began at the entryway leading into ancient Babylon, the gate of Ishtar. The pride parades began in New York City, the modern Babylon, at the gate into America, the gateway, New York City. The ancient parades began at the city wall. The pride parades began at Stonewall. The gate of the goddess was made up of 2 brick-covered archways, a smaller and greater. The Stonewall Inn likewise possessed 2 brick-covered archways, a smaller and a greater. And then the gate of Ishtar was famous for its depictions of lions, another symbol of the goddess. The processions and parades birthed at Stonewall began under the Lion's Head at Lion's Head Pub. It's amazing. And these parades that celebrated sexual debauchery were described in ancient literature. It goes like this: the people of Sumer, these are non-Semitic people of ancient Babylon. That's who the people of Sumer are. Parade before you. I say hail to Inyana, Ishtar, great lady of heaven. They beat the holy drum and timpani before you. They play the holy harp and timpani before you. The people of Sumer parade before you. The women adorn their right side with men's clothing. The men adorn their left side with women's clothing. The parades were a public spectacle. The transgender, the cross-dresser, the homosexual, the intersexual, and the cross-gendered. Even a modern transgender commentator writing of the goddess's ancient festival could not fail to see the connection when she wrote, the description of the festival appears to show the people of the city cross-dressing specifically for the purpose of the celebration. Indeed, the whole thing sounds very like a gay pride parade. The similarities of the parades are uncanny. Men wearing women's clothing, singing, dancing, carrying female symbols. There's an ancient Sumerian in scripture that says this: the male prostitutes comb their hair before you. They decorate the napes of their necks with colored scarves. So ancient inscriptions of Ishtar's parade tell us that in order to look more like a woman, some of the homosexual priests let their hair grow long, and then after tightening their hair grips for her, that's a quote, male prostitutes would parade before her, holy Inyana, Ishtar, and their locks of hair at the back are adorned for her with colored rags. The mention of both cross-gendered men and colored cloths or rags is also striking because both are elements described in the modern pride parades. Now, we could go on and on. In his novel Metamorphosis, the 2nd century Roman writer, Apulus, describes the parades of Ishtar. Here's what he says. The following day they went out, wearing various colored undergarments, with turbans and saffron robes, and linen garments thrown over them, and everyone hideously made up, their faces crazy with muddy paints, and their eyes artfully lined. Some wore tunics fastened with belts with purple stripes flowing in every direction like spears, and yellow shoes on their feet. Now I want you to think about the modern pride parade. That's an ancient rite. That's an ancient text before the Jesus movement. The modern pride parade, men displaying themselves as women, adorning themselves with colored fabrics, eyeliner and heavily exaggerated makeup, transvestites, female impersonators, drag queens. Folks, this is not the celebration of diversity. This is a celebration of lunacy and debauchery. The descriptions of ancient processions include words like licentious, bawdy, unbridled, and lewd. So if the goddess returns to the Western world, she would return with her parades and celebrations. And I'm telling you that today, all around the world, millions are walking in the footsteps of the ancient priests and becoming her servants. Now stay with me. You okay? Stay with me. Ishtar's power, under her power, women would take on the roles of men, and then they would become lovers of women, lesbians. Now I haven't talked about the female side of this very often, but I need to just for a moment before I take you home, okay? At Stonewall, a lesbian in handcuffs was the catalyst for the riots. Lesbians made up a large part of Ishtar parades as they do modern pride parades. But what's quite amazing is the fact that the most basic modern representation of lesbianism is that of 2 crosses topped with 2 large circles intertwined with each other. 2 symbols of the female joined together. Now, where did that come from? Well, the Swedish botanist Carl Linnaeus in the 18th century used it to represent female flowers. He took the symbol from the Greeks, who used it to represent metal copper, which was associated with the planet Venus. The planet was associated with the goddess Venus. Venus was the incarnation of Aphrodite and Ishtar. So the sign that represents lesbianism today, on purpose or not, I don't know. Remember what we said? You don't have to do it on purpose. If the gods or goddesses return, these things will return, incidentally or on purpose. But the sign that represents lesbianism today goes all the way back to Ishtar. Two Venuses, two goddesses, two Ishtars intertwined together. In fact, the great poet Sappho, who had significant influence in the 7th century BC, the modern revival of lesbianism takes inspiration from the Greek poet Sappho. Now, I'm just quoting to you from the lesbian movement. So this is not conjecture, this is just their words. Sappho led a theos, or it's called a theaso, which is a type of community for young women. Sappho, the influential Greek poet, said that she had a sexual attraction to her students, and that the patron deity protecting Sappho's community was the goddess Aphrodite, the Greek incarnation of Ishtar. Sappho actually worshiped the goddess and wrote about being intimately acquainted with her. And in Sappho's poems, we learn heaps. In one of those poems is a prayer to Ishtar in which Sappho pleads with the goddess, who she calls, by the way, the terrible enchantress, to alter the affections of women toward her, away from men toward her. What's really interesting is Sappho was born on a Greek island called Lesbos. From that word comes our word lesbian. Lesbos, Sappho, Aphrodite, Ishtar. And you just keep going. There's so much I had to leave out, but if you think of the colors purple, violet, and lavender fill the poetry of Sappho, which is why it was incorporated into the flag, the pride flag, in 1999, or even actually before that, but it became prominent then. In fact, in 1999, another symbol for lesbianism arose that has become primary symbol today. It's a symbol of an axe with two blades, a double-edged axe or a labrys. Now, how does this represent lesbianism? Because in the days of the Roman Empire, the double-edged axe was associated with a mythological warrior or warriors known as the Amazons. And the Amazons were all women warriors. The axe symbolized women's independence from men while taking on the nature and place of men. And the reason that's important is because the gay pride movement today sees themselves as heirs to the ancient Amazons. And then there's the whole thing of Tammuz. That's a Hebrew word. Tammuz or Tammuz. There's different ways to pronounce it. But Tammuz is also, let's call it Tammuz, I'm more comfortable. Tammuz is the month of June on the Gregorian calendar. The name of Ishtar's lover is also Tammuz. Ishtar's lover, Tammuz, separated from her in a very dramatic event. And as a result, I can't go into the whole story, and again, it's mythology. Her lover, Tammuz, was sent into the lower regions where he could mourn his loss. But a major part of the story speaks of the sorrow and anger of Ishtar because of her loss. Now, strangely enough, in the ancient world, the month of June became a time when Ishtar was most celebrated and worshiped. Every June in the ancient world, for 29 days, the goddess was celebrated. It was the month of her unfulfilled longings, her unanswered passions, her denied desires. So for her worshipers, June was the month in which she was adored, celebrated, and worshiped and admired. June was to Ishtar and her followers what December is to modern Christians. Think about December, the whole month. I mean, we celebrate Christmas December 25th, but the whole month is what? Office parties, parades, feasts, celebrations. So the month of June in the ancient world to Ishtar for 29 days focused on the goddess. So if Ishtar was to come back into the West, her signs and symbols would also follow her. Now, pay attention. I find it more than coincidence that Stonewall happened in late June. Pride parades permeate the Western world in the month of June. Gay Pride Month is June. The month that separated Tammuz from Ishtar is the month that separates male and female, June. The movement continues to expand and to celebrate the turning of men away from women and the turning of women away from men. And June, throughout the West, in our modern world, celebrates Ishtar, whether it knows it or not. Her festivals, her evil practices, sexual immorality, and gender confusion. And if the goddess Ishtar were to return, would she not lay claim to the month of June? And is that exactly what she's done? And her celebrations now are actually forced upon her and upon us in the public. In the ancient world, folks, before the Jesus movement, for 29 days, the Middle Eastern calendar was especially given to the possession of the goddess, her lover, and her mythology. So you had riots and festivals and parades and processions for 29 days in June. And then there's the flag. The rainbow flag, designed by Gilbert Baker, an openly gay man and drag queen. It was first flown, you guessed it, June 25, 1978. The original flag had 8 colors, okay? Each representing one of 8 elements in the movement. Pink represented sex. Red represented life. Orange, healing. Yellow, light and sun. Green, nature. Turquoise, magic. Indigo, serenity. And violet, spirit. Now, there have been so many people try to research how all of these fit together, and quite frankly, they just don't. The only unifying theme of this haphazardness is Ishtar. Was it done on purpose? I don't know. Pink, sex. Ishtar was the goddess of sex. She was the embodiment of passion, lust, unbridled sexual desire, and debauchery. Red, life. Ishtar was said to be the goddess of fertility and procreation. Orange, healing. Ishtar's Mesopotamian manifestation was Gula, the goddess who takes away sickness. Yellow, light and sun. Ishtar was associated with the celestial lights. The morning and evening star would carry her name, Venus. And the moon was her father. But the sun was inextricably bound to Ishtar. She was said to be the sun's twin sister, which is why we find a sun disk at her side in many of her carved images. Green, nature. Ishtar was the embodiment of nature. She brought fruitfulness to the earth with thunder, rains, and storms. Turquoise, magic. Ishtar was always casting spells and enchantments to turn a man's desire from a woman's and a woman's from a man. Indigo, serenity. You say, how can a goddess who's described as the storm, like you said last week, also be described by indigo, serenity? Well, that's the thing about the foreign modern mythological gods. They are a myriad of contradictions. However, it was said that people came to the altars of Ishtar and actually would pray an old Babylonian hymn that went like this: "At your glance, serenity comes into my being." Violet, spirit. Ishtar is the spirit, wouldn't you say? But of what kind? And the answer is demonic. But perhaps the most compelling of all is the fact that an ancient Elamite inscription gives us Ishtar's, which I've held off until now, full name. Do you know what Ishtar's full name is? Manzat Ishtar, Rainbow Ishtar. What's the message I'm trying to get across? I'm trying to say that at Stonewall, the ancient goddesses forced open the door into America. And there were 3 landmark cases. Stay with me. It's going to be shorter if you stay with me. If you don't, I'll stretch it out. Okay, it's almost over. And believe me, I'm as glad that it's over as you are. Okay, but stay with me. Let me end this and set us up for next week. At Stonewall, ancient doors were open. There were 3 landmark cases in America. And I've spent so much time trying to research these cases and all the events, and I was going to do a whole series on this. Let's just speak them out, and you can do your own homework. The first landmark case, 2003, Lawrence versus Texas. The Supreme Court legalized homosexuality. Then that same year legalized same-sex marriage. By the way, the decision came, guess what month? June. June 26, 2003, which was the exact day the Stonewall uprising was sealed and its warrant was issued and the legal authorization was given to set everything in motion. I mean, are the gods really that organized? Yes. Yes, they are. The second landmark case, the United States versus Windsor, 2013. And again, that's why I said in the beginning of the series, if you didn't grow up in America and you didn't go to the schools and experience what we did before, and you just don't get this, because we are a very unique nation, folks, extremely unique. United States versus Windsor. This is the ruling that overturned the Defense of Marriage Act, and it led to the federal government recognizing same-sex marriages performed in states where it had previously been legalized. When do you think that ruling happened? Would you like to guess? June 26, 2013, the month of Tammuz, the month of Ishtar, the month of Stonewall, the month the Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage. Not civil union, but same-sex marriage, redefining marriage. It was 10 years to the exact date that the Supreme Court legalized homosexuality in 2003. Both those rulings opened the door for the normalization and establishment of homosexuality and lesbianism. And they occurred on the same date Stonewall was sealed. Now here's the third door. The Supreme Court case. Obergefell versus Hodges. This was a historic ruling. It struck down the historical, biblical, age-old definition of marriage between a woman and a man, and it legalized same-sex marriage across America. Would you like to guess when that took place? June 26, 2015. Again, Jonathan Codd writes, it is hard for the modern mind to fathom the idea that the political, cultural, and judicial events of modern times could be determined by an ancient mystery from the Middle East. But the exact convergence of all these events and factors is stunning. On the night that the biblical definition and ordination of biblical marriage was struck down in America, the same night, do you know what happened? A sign appeared all across America. It was on the Empire State Building. It lit up the waters of Niagara Falls. It lit up the iconic castle at Disney World. And most remarkably, it lit up the building from which America was governed, the White House. Do you think the demonic forces are pleased that the last bastion of Judeo-Christian values defeated? Don't you find it interesting that you can't put a cross in public, but you can put a rainbow flag? You can't put a cross, the Bible, the Ten Commandments in many public places. But the rainbow and the rainbow flag can be enshrined in the public square. You can manifest it on public property, municipal halls, government buildings. And now in some places, it's even appearing on police cars. It's flown outside of American embassies all around the world. It's displayed in commercial buildings, athletic fields, corporate headquarters. But you can't put the cross up. The Bible, the representations of the thing that made America so prosperous. What do we do? For those of us who love this country, pray. But before we really make the turn, because let me tell you something, America is unique in that you and I are in a position that many people who have gone through this in the past have not been able to experience, and that is we are actually, I was going to say a democracy, and I hope I don't offend anybody, but we're more of a republic than we are a democracy. But that's another time for sure. But you and I do have power. And we're going to talk about that. Well, how does that power, and how do we release that power without losing the position that we really have as citizens of the kingdom of heaven, going after people who are far from God? Well, let me tell you 3 things quickly. When the gods return, the first thing you've got to realize is they return but for one purpose. If the gods are here, they return for one purpose, and that purpose is for the final showdown. So if the demonic forces have returned from the fridges, the time is near. I don't know how near. I'm not a prophet. Anybody that tells you how near, run. But can I tell you something? Do you remember the story in the Old Testament where God is going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah because of this type of thing? And Abraham goes to God and he says, God, are you really going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah? What if are you going to, and I think the exact verse, will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Genesis 18:23. You're going to bring judgment. What about all the righteous people? If I find 50 righteous, will you relent? And God said, yeah, if you find 50 righteous, Abraham, I won't destroy it. Oh, okay, God. Abraham. Okay, God, how about 45? Can I go 45? Yes, Abraham, 45. Okay, well, how about 30? Can we go 30? Yeah. How about 20? What if we find 20? How about 10? Suddenly, Abraham gets it. That God is not quick, but he's very patient and very slow. But that story, I've often wondered, why did God put that in there? People ask me sometimes, how can you believe in a God who would tell the Israelites to go in to destroy the Amalekites? Men, women, children. Well, remember, when society becomes so corrupt that there's no righteous left, it means the more you procreate unrighteousness. And that's when God says, this far, no further. My belief personally is when our country, when this generation, when we get so far away from God that there's no one righteous left, the destruction comes. When the battle occurs, which side are you on? James 4, you adulterous people, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. You know what that means, folks? Young people, I got some young people. Let me tell you what it means. Your culture is trying to sway you. It's powerful because there are demonic forces that mean to destroy you, your relationship with God, and everything that you hold sacred. So you got to make a choice in your life. You're either going to be friends with God or enmity. Enmity means with hatred. And if you're so in love with the world that you just go the flow of the world, you think you're neutral. You say, well, I can go this way and not hate God. God says, no, you either love God or you hate him. And if you love him, you follow him. If you hate him, you go the flow of the world, which always takes you away from God. But it's more stringent than that. And this gospel has not been preached. We're afraid to say this to people. But the reality is, and we're told in Ephesians 5, have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. It is shameful even to mention what the disobedient do in secret. And the one that gets me every time is Luke 12. From now on, there will be 5 in one family divided against each other. 3 against 2, 2 against 3. They will be divided, father against son, son against father, mother against daughter, and daughter against mother, mother-in-law against daughter-in-law, and daughter-in-law against mother-in-law. Jesus said, if you love your mother or your father more than me, if you love your son or daughter more than me, you're not worthy of me. What does he mean? When you go to a gay pride parade because you think you're supporting your son, you're not. You're supporting Ishtar in all her ways. Listen, you can love your son and daughter. You can love them without condoning or participating in the fruitless works of darkness. And you know what? When you do, you may lose your son and daughter for a season. But if you continue to participate where they are, you'll lose them for life. There's a chance that because you've taught them the way they should go when they're older, they won't fall away from it. But if you move with them and you think you're being kind, look, they don't need a buddy. They need a mother and a father. And they need somebody who will stand up and say, I love you, and there's nothing you could ever do to make me not love you. But this is wrong, and it's not what God has for you, and I cannot support you in it, but I will always love you. If you're one of those people who say, well, I'm going to just let my children make up their own mind about life, can I tell you something in love? You're an idiot. Because you're an idiot. Because if you're not teaching your children, somebody else is. Do you understand that? If you're not aggressively teaching your children, I guarantee you their cell phones teaching them, somebody else is teaching them. Be clear to your children about what they're being exposed to and explain it. When the gods return, we must make sure that we have nothing to do with the fruitless works of darkness. And then finally and quickly, I got to end. During the return of the gods, we must lean into spiritual disciplines that keep us from falling away. I keep saying this every message. You are not strong enough to resist the pull of the world. And if you are not involved in the spiritual disciplines, if you're not meeting with accountability, with friends who hold you accountable, that you can run ideas by, that you can talk about life with. If you're an island, I'm telling you, you're setting yourself up for destruction. Do you see that? Some of the best news I've gotten lately, and I hope I don't embarrass anybody, and I'm going to read it as I've written. One of the most joyful pieces of news that I've had in a long time is the news that some of my best and closest friends are all meeting together. So Mike Masterson, Randy Webb, David Jacks, Anthony McMahon, Paige Martin are all in the same small group. And when I heard that, I thought, finally, those hammerheads. They're meeting together and they're growing together. And I'm thinking, the other day I was thinking, man, maybe I need to join that group. Those are some cool people. Now that doesn't mean your group's not cool. It just wouldn't be as cool as mine. Yeah, I know. Okay, I got to end. Listen, Don't miss next week, please, or you'll and you can go back and listen to these sermons and you can test and Google and do your own research, but we can't leave without this, okay? I gave you this message not to inspire you to hate anyone. Oh, man. These are our sons and daughters. I'm not trying to get you to look at those. I don't want you to look at a pride parade with hate. I want you to look at it with compassion and know that the demonic forces have returned. And there are people who have genuine hurts and needs, and there's genuine confusion because of a culture and a world that's trying to rob them of their joy. Don't hate them. Don't spew vitriolic language at them. Stand for what is right, but do it with compassion. We changed our name to One and All. Do you know why? Well, there's many reasons, but the primary reason is because we wanted everybody to know that no matter who you are and where you've been and whatever sin you're struggling with, this is your new home. You say, well, Pastor Jeff, if that's true, man, if there's been anybody who's struggled, during this series, I got to tell you, if there are people who've struggled with these things, they're never going to be back. I knew I was taking that risk, but sometimes the father has to talk to the children, and they got to remind you, hey, listen, here's where we are. But we don't hammer this all the time. I probably won't talk about this stuff for a long time now. Help me. We want to be a place that no matter who you are and where you've been and what you've done, your sin is no worse than mine. Mine is no better than you. We are all sinners in need of forgiveness through the grace of Jesus Christ, right? And he stood up and he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and he stood up to read. And he was handed a book from the prophet Isaiah. And when he opened the book, he found the place where it is written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord." That's what we want to do. Set the captives free. Father, thank you for your goodness. As always, I pray that anything that I've said that is consistent with your word, that it would go down very deep. And Father, it would govern our lives. It would transform us. But anything I've said that is not consistent with your word, that it be forgotten and it would be seen on the wayside, just trampled on the road, never remembered again. And so, Father, through all of this, help us to see what's happening in culture, but as we do, to love and show compassion for all who are far from God, because we are one and all. Everyone's welcome in Christ's name. Everybody said, amen.